Cleopatra. Her name has become a synonym for seduction and fatal passion. In the imagination of millions, she endures as the last queen of Egypt, a figure whose exotic beauty maddened the two greatest Romans of her time, bringing the world to the very brink of war. But who in reality was this woman? Was she a perfidious seductress who wielded her allure as a primary weapon in the bedchambers of Caesar and Antony? Or was she the last great ruler of the Hellenistic world, a brilliant politician, a polyglot, and a scholar who, in a desperate struggle for the survival of her kingdom, stood alone against the almighty power of Rome? This narrative seeks to separate the myth from the historical truth. It will recount her ruthless struggle for the throne against her own family and her legendary alliances with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, exploring whether these unions were born of blinding passion or of cold political calculation. It is the tale of the last queen of the Nile, whose mind was sharper than any Roman sword, and whose defeat marked the end of an entire era and the birth of the Roman Empire. To understand Cleopatra, one must first understand the world that surrounded her. The middle of the 1st century BC was an era of giants and agony. The Mediterranean Sea had ceased to be a mosaic of independent kingdoms. It was becoming a Roman lake. The Roman Republic itself was tearing apart in the titanic struggle of its greatest sons, Pompey, Caesar, Crassus. Their ambitions shook the world, and their legions were an implacable force redrawing the map of the planet. In this new world, one could only be an ally of Rome or its province. There was no third path. And in this world, Egypt was the last great prize. It was no longer the empire that built the Great Pyramids. It was a Hellenistic kingdom founded by one of Alexander the Great's generals, Ptolemy I. His descendants, the Ptolemaic dynasty, had ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years. By the time of Cleopatra's birth, this kingdom, though still fabulously wealthy, the breadbasket of the Mediterranean, was politically in a coma. It depended entirely on Rome. The Ptolemaic court in Alexandria had become a viper's nest of intrigues, betrayals, and fratricidal wars. In the previous 100 years, almost no ruler had died a natural death. Brothers killed brothers, sisters poisoned sisters, sons overthrew fathers, often with the direct support of some Roman proconsul. It was a world where the only laws were the right of the strongest and the art of survival. It was in this cruel, yet intellectually refined world that Cleopatra VII Philopator was born in 69 BC. And here is the first myth that must be destroyed. Cleopatra was not Egyptian. Not a drop of Egyptian blood ran through her veins. She was Greek, Macedonian, a direct descendant of Ptolemy himself. Her native language was Greek. Her culture, her education, her worldview, everything was Greek. Her childhood was spent in the heart of Alexandria, the intellectual capital of the world at that time. It was not a simple city. It was Alexander the Great's dream made stone. With its gigantic lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the world, with its broad avenues, with the legendary Library of Alexandria, the greatest repository of knowledge in antiquity, and the Museion, a kind of academy of sciences where the brightest minds of the era worked. The young princess grew up breathing the air of erudition and high culture, receiving the best education imaginable. She studied the philosophy of Plato, the rhetoric of Aristotle, the mathematics of Euclid, astronomy and medicine. But her greatest talent was languages. The ancient historian Plutarch wrote that her voice was like an instrument of many strings. She was a polyglot. Besides her native Greek, she spoke Aramaic, Ethiopian, Persian, and Hebrew. And most importantly, she was the first and only one of her entire dynasty to learn the language of her subjects, Egyptian. This fact says more about her than all the legends about her beauty. It was a brilliant political move. She could communicate directly with her people and, more importantly, with the powerful priesthood, something none of her predecessors had done. She demonstrated that she was their queen, not a foreign ruler. Her father, Ptolemy XII, passed into history with the humiliating nickname Auletes, the flute player. He was a weak, dissolute, and unpopular ruler who kept his throne only thanks to enormous bribes paid to Roman politicians. His reign was so disastrous that the Alexandrians expelled him, and he was forced to flee to Rome, humbly begging the Senate for help. The young Cleopatra was likely with him. She saw with her own eyes her father, the king of Egypt, wandering the antechambers of Roman senators, borrowing money from usurers and living in debt. She learned the main lesson. Weakness and dependence on Rome lead to humiliation. While her father was in exile, her older sister, Berenice, seized the throne. But when Ptolemy XII returned with Roman legions, he mercilessly executed his own daughter. Cleopatra learned the second lesson. The struggle for power in her family was a struggle to the death. In 51 BC, the flute player died. In his will, ratified in Rome, he left the throne to his 18-year-old daughter Cleopatra and her 10-year-old brother Ptolemy XIII. According to Egyptian tradition, they were to marry and rule jointly. But Cleopatra was too ambitious to share power with anyone, let alone a child who was nothing more than a puppet in the hands of his advisors. Real power at court was held by a triumvirate surrounding the young king. The eunuch Pothinus, his prime minister, a cunning and power-hungry man. General Achilles, commander of the army, and his tutor, the rhetorician Theodotus. These men understood perfectly that the brilliantly educated, strong-willed, and popular Cleopatra would never be their docile puppet. They bet on her younger brother. Cleopatra tried to rule alone. She minted coins with only her profile, without mentioning her co-regent. She personally handled grain distribution during a famine, winning the love of the common Alexandrians. She behaved not as a co-regent, but as the sole queen. It was a direct challenge to the powerful courtiers. In 48 BC, Pothinus and Achilles staged a coup d'etat. Using the army and spreading rumors that Cleopatra wanted to rule alone, which was true, they turned the capital against her. Cleopatra was expelled from Alexandria. She was forced to flee to Syria, where, showing unbreakable will, she began to act immediately. Using her royal name and her remaining jewels, she started gathering her own army of mercenaries to retake the throne by force. Civil war in the last great Hellenistic kingdom became inevitable. Her position was almost desperate. She had against her the entire army of Egypt and the entire court cabal. But at that precise moment, when it seemed all was lost, the sails of Roman ships appeared on the horizon. The great civil war in Rome, the war between Pompey and Julius Caesar, had reached the Egyptian shores, and with it came the man who could either destroy Cleopatra definitively or become her only chance for salvation. Gaius Julius Caesar himself. In the autumn of 48 BC, the man who had just won the war for mastery of the world landed in Egypt. Gaius Julius Caesar, after annihilating the army of his main rival, Pompey the Great, at the Battle of Pharsalus, had pursued him to Alexandria itself. He arrived with a small detachment, barely 4,000 legionaries, confident in his status as victor and supreme arbiter. But Egypt received him with an act of monstrous and short-sighted treachery. The advisors of the young King Ptolemy XIII, the eunuch Pothinus and General Achilles, wishing to curry favor with Caesar, made a fatal decision. They murdered Pompey, who sought refuge with them, and presented Caesar with his severed head as a gift. The calculation was simple. They thought Caesar would be grateful for the elimination of his enemy, but they had not understood whom they were dealing with. Caesar, upon seeing the head of his former son-in-law and the greatest of Romans, according to legend, turned away in disgust and wept. It was an insult to the grandeur of Rome. The murder of a Roman consul, whoever he might be, was a crime that barbarians were not permitted to commit. It was not a simple moral gesture. Caesar was furious. He had been deprived of the opportunity to show his famous clementia, mercy, toward a vanquished enemy, and to demonstrate his magnanimity to Rome. The Egyptian court had stolen his political triumph. Caesar immediately occupied the royal palace in Alexandria and announced that he, as consul of the Roman Republic and executor of the will of the late Ptolemy XII, would personally decide who would govern Egypt. He demanded that both Ptolemy XIII and Cleopatra dissolve their armies and present themselves before his tribunal. For the court cabal, it was a catastrophe. They had lost Caesar's favor. But for Cleopatra, who was in exile with her army on the border, it was the only, almost impossible opportunity. She was isolated from the capital by her brother's army, which blocked all approaches to the city. Breaking through by force was impossible. Traveling to Caesar's judgment meant certain death at the hands of her enemies along the way. She needed to reach the palace, to reach Caesar unseen. And then the 21-year-old queen devised a plan that would pass into legend. It was not the ruse of a seductress. It was a bold and desperate all-or-nothing gambit with her life and the throne of Egypt at stake. Secretly, under the cover of night, in a small fishing boat accompanied only by a faithful servant, the Sicilian Apollodorus, she approached the harbor of Alexandria, right under the walls of the palace occupied by Caesar. But how to pass the guards? And here is where the legend is born. According to Plutarch, Apollodorus tucked Cleopatra into a bedroll, often mistranslated as a carpet. He threw it over his shoulder and, posing as a simple merchant bringing a gift to Caesar, passed through all the checkpoints. We can only imagine the scene. Caesar, the 52-year-old dictator, weary of war, sitting in his chambers, reflecting on the destinies of the world. And suddenly, a dirty sack is brought into the room, from which, right at his feet, emerges the young queen of Egypt, disheveled but full of determination. It was a stroke of genius. Not only had she infiltrated the palace, but she had done so in a way that made an indelible impression. She demonstrated not beauty, but incredible courage, intelligence, and the willingness to risk everything. Caesar, who valued precisely these qualities in people, was intrigued. That night they held a long conversation, and it was not a night of seduction. It was political negotiation at the highest level. Cleopatra, brilliantly educated, speaking many languages, presented her position. She did not appeal to his passion, but to his reason and political interest. She showed him that her brother was nothing more than a puppet in the hands of advisors hostile to Rome, that only she, the legitimate heir, could be a reliable and predictable ally for Rome, that a stable and prosperous Egypt under her rule would punctually supply grain to Rome and pay its debts. She spoke to him as an equal, as one monarch to another. And Caesar, the greatest pragmatist of his time, made his decision. He bet on Cleopatra. The next morning he summoned Ptolemy XIII and his advisors and announced his decision. Cleopatra and her brother would rule jointly, as stipulated in their father's will. For Pothinus and his cabal, this meant the end of their power. They understood they had lost and decided to take extreme measures. On their orders, the army under Achilles surrounded the palace, initiating the so-called Alexandrian War. Caesar's few thousand legionaries were trapped in a strange and hostile city, besieged by an army of 20,000 men. Months of fierce street fighting followed. During one of them, the famous Library of Alexandria caught fire and was partially destroyed. Caesar and Cleopatra fought for their lives, side by side, Finally, with the arrival of reinforcements from Rome, Caesar achieved victory. Ptolemy XIII's army was annihilated, and the young king himself, attempting to flee, drowned in the Nile. His advisors were executed. Cleopatra reclaimed her throne. Caesar, to respect Egyptian customs, formally married her to her younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, aged 12. But real power now belonged entirely to her. Their alliance was sealed by the birth of a son, whom the Alexandrians immediately nicknamed Caesarion, Little Caesar. For Caesar, it was possibly his only biological son. But for Cleopatra, it was much more. It was her main trump card, her hope for the future. Through her son's veins ran the blood of the Ptolemies and that of the greatest Roman. He was the living symbol of the union of Egypt and Rome, the future ruler of a great Hellenistic empire that would govern the world in alliance, not in submission to Rome. Cleopatra had bet on the most powerful man in the world, and she had won. But she did not yet know that her main ally was mortal, and that his enemies in Rome were already sharpening their daggers. After the end of the grueling Alexandrian War, Cleopatra finally became the sole ruler of Egypt. Her internal enemies were dead, and her throne was protected by 3 Roman legions left by Caesar. The brightest and seemingly most serene period of her reign began. She was not a simple queen. She was a living deity, the new incarnation of Isis, the Great Mother, giver of life. And she used this image with incredible skill, combining ancient Egyptian rituals with the refined Greek culture of her court. Caesar, instead of returning immediately to Rome, where urgent matters awaited him, remained in Egypt for several more months, officially to stabilize the situation. Unofficially, he was fascinated, not so much by the 22-year-old queen herself as by her world. A world of ancient and incomprehensible culture, of refined luxury, and of a sacred, divine power that in Rome, with its eternal Senate disputes, one could only dream of. They undertook the legendary voyage up the Nile, which passed into history as the symbol of their union. It was not a simple romantic excursion, it was a grandiose political demonstration. Cleopatra organized an entire flotilla of 400 ships. At its center was her personal barge, a gigantic thalamegos. It was a floating palace, a 2-decked vessel nearly 100 meters long, with colonnades, temples, banquet halls, and gardens. On this barge, surrounded by her court, Cleopatra showed Caesar her country, its ancient temples at Thebes and Karnak, its fertile lands, its incalculable riches. She demonstrated that Egypt was not a simple province to be looted, but a great civilization worthy of being an equal partner to Rome. Shortly after Caesar's departure, Cleopatra gave birth to a son, Ptolemy XV Caesar. The people of Alexandria, with their sharp Greek humor, immediately nicknamed the boy Caesarion, Little Caesar. Little Caesar was her greatest achievement, the cornerstone of all her future plans. She was no longer a simple ally of Rome. She was the mother of Caesar's only son. She held in her hands a living bridge between 2 worlds. She began to hatch dynastic plans of incredible scale. She visualized a future in which her son, heir to Alexander and Caesar, would rule a new, unified Greco-Roman empire, with its capital not in conservative Rome, but in her brilliant and cosmopolitan Alexandria. In 46 BC, Caesar, after celebrating 4 grandiose triumphs in Rome and consolidating himself as dictator, invited Cleopatra and her court to the capital of the world. This visit was a genuine bomb that detonated conservative Roman society. Cleopatra did not arrive as a submissive vassal queen, but as an equal. Caesar housed her in his luxurious suburban villa across the Tiber. She brought not only her court but her culture, her exotic and divine aura. Her villa became the most fashionable salon in Rome. Roman aristocrats, poets, philosophers, all flocked to see the famous queen. But for the Roman elite, this was an unheard-of insult. They did not see in her a brilliantly educated monarch, but the whore queen, the Egyptian prostitute who had bewitched their dictator. They were indignant at everything: her luxury, her independent behavior, her status as a goddess. The great orator Cicero, who visited her villa, wrote in his letters, "I hate the queen. Her arrogance is unbearable." But the straw that broke the camel's back was that Caesar, violating all Roman traditions, ordered a golden statue of Cleopatra, represented as the goddess Venus Genitrix, the mythical ancestor of his own lineage, to be erected in the very heart of Rome. For the senators, this was sacrilege. It was direct proof that Caesar wanted to convert the Republic into an Oriental monarchy and himself into a god-king, with Cleopatra in the role of his divine consort. Hatred toward her became inseparable from hatred toward Caesar. Cleopatra spent nearly 2 years in Rome. She witnessed the apogee of Caesar's power, his transformation into dictator for life. She saw the conspiracy brewing in the Senate, and on March 15th, 44 BC, her world collapsed. Gaius Julius Caesar, her protector, her ally, the father of her son, was stabbed to death by a group of senators right at the foot of the statue of his old enemy, Pompey. For Cleopatra, it was an absolute catastrophe. In an instant, she lost everything. Her status in Rome went from guest of honor to mistress of the assassinated tyrant. Her life and her sons were in mortal danger. In Caesar's will, read after his death, there was not a word about her or Caesarion. He named his 18-year-old grandnephew, Gaius Octavius, as his principal heir. All her dynastic dreams were shattered. Chaos began in Rome. Caesar's assassins, the liberators, and his heirs, his loyal lieutenant, Mark Antony, and the young, unknown Octavian, entered a struggle to the death for power. Cleopatra understood that in this new and cruel world there was no place for her. Secretly, under the cover of night, she fled Rome and returned to Alexandria. Upon returning, she took her first ruthless step as an independent ruler. Her younger brother and co-regent, Ptolemy XIV, died suddenly. Almost all historians agree he was poisoned on her orders. She had learned the cruel lessons of her family. In the struggle for power, there can be no two victors. Now there was no one in her way. She immediately proclaimed her 3-year-old son, Caesarion, as her co-regent under the name Ptolemy XV. Now she ruled in the name of Caesar's son. He was her only shield and her only argument in the coming struggle. The next 3 years were a time of waiting, maneuvering, and wise governance. While Rome tore itself apart in another civil war, Cleopatra dedicated herself to strengthening her kingdom. She carried out economic reforms. She fought against famine, opening the royal granaries to the people. She traveled the country, participating in ancient religious ceremonies, presenting herself to her people as the goddess Isis. She strengthened the army and the fleet. She ruled as a competent and solicitous monarch, earning the love and loyalty of her subjects. But she knew this peace would not last. Sooner or later, the victors of the Roman war would come for her riches. After Caesar's assassins, Brutus and Cassius, were defeated at the Battle of Philippi, the world was divided again. The West went to Caesar's cold and calculating adopted son, Octavian, and the East, including all the Hellenistic kingdoms, went to the most brilliant and popular of Caesar's generals, Mark Antony. It was precisely Antony who became her new objective. In 41 BC, while consolidating his power in the east, Mark Antony arrived in the city of Tarsus in Asia Minor and summoned the Queen of Egypt to his presence to be judged. She was accused of having aided his enemies. Cleopatra, once again, as in the case of Caesar, found herself in the position of an accused who must present herself before a Roman lord. But this time, she was no longer a young fugitive. She was a 30-year-old experienced queen at the peak of her power, and she decided that this time, the meeting would unfold according to her rules.
After the defeat of Caesar's assassins at the Battle of Philippi, power over the ruins of the Roman Republic was divided between two men. In the west, in Rome itself, remained the young, cold, and calculating Gaius Octavian, Caesar's adopted son and heir. He was a master of political intrigue, a man who acted slowly but inexorably, like a glacier. The East, on the other hand, went to Mark Antony. Antony was the complete opposite of Octavian. He was a man of the Renaissance, born in the era of Rome, a brilliant general, Caesar's loyal lieutenant, the idol of the legions. He was generous, charismatic, and possessed an indomitable appetite for everything, for wine, for women, for glory. He was a Hercules in spirit and, as he himself claimed, in lineage. He despised the petty senatorial intrigues of Rome and felt at home in the luxurious and culturally refined Hellenistic capitals of the East. It was this man who became the new lord of the part of the world where Egypt lay. In 41 BC, while consolidating his power and raising money for a grandiose campaign against the Parthian Empire, Mark Antony arrived in the city of Tarsus in Asia Minor. He began to summon all the vassal rulers of the East to his presence to be judged. Among them was Cleopatra. The official accusation? She had supposedly aided his enemies, Caesar's assassins. But the real reason was much more prosaic. Antony desperately needed money, and Egypt was immensely rich. He intended to fine the queen an enormous sum and remind her who was now the master in the East. Cleopatra, once again, as 4 years earlier with Caesar, found herself in the position of an accused who must present herself before a Roman lord. But this time, she was no longer a young fugitive. She was an experienced queen of 28, at the peak of her power, and perhaps her feminine allure. She knew whom she was dealing with. She knew Antony was not the cold pragmatist that Caesar had been. He was a lover of luxury, of theatricality, and of grand gestures. And she decided that this time the meeting would unfold according to her rules. She did not rush to Tarsus at the first summons. She ignored several of his messages, making him wait, stoking his curiosity and irritation. She was not preparing a courtesy visit, but an entire spectacle calculated to impress the imagination of this new Dionysus, as Antony liked to call himself. Finally, when everything was ready, she set sail. Her arrival at Tarsus via the Cydnus River became one of the most famous performances in history. Antony awaited her in the city square, seated on a tribune and surrounded by the crowd. But Cleopatra did not go to him. Instead, a rumor spread through the city that the goddess Aphrodite herself, Venus to the Romans, had arrived to meet the god Dionysus, Bacchus, for the good of all Asia. Antony and the entire crowd of the city ran to the river, and what they saw surpassed all expectations. Slowly sailing up the river was a gigantic barge with a gilded stern and purple sails. The oarsmen moved silver oars to the rhythm of soft music from flutes and lyres. From the deck emanated the scent of exotic incense, enveloping the banks in a cloud of fragrant smoke. And on the deck itself, under a canopy embroidered with gold, lay Cleopatra herself, dressed as the goddess of love, Aphrodite. Around her, boys with fans represented Eros,
and her most beautiful handmaidens, dressed as nymphs and graces, manned the ship's rigging. It was not a seduction. It was a brilliant political statement. She did not present herself as an accused queen, but as a goddess equal to him. The luxury demonstrated not only her beauty, but her incalculable wealth and refined taste, showing she was the ruler of a civilization, not a simple barbarian kingdom. Antony was stunned. He invited her to dinner immediately.
But Cleopatra, continuing her game, replied that it would be more appropriate for him to visit her first. And Antony agreed. He went to her ship. The banquet she organized amazed even this Roman so well-versed in luxury. The halls were covered with rose petals. The lighting was so soft and studied that it created a magical atmosphere. And the delicacies and wines were the most exquisite. But the main thing was not that. The main thing was Cleopatra herself. Antony expected to meet an exotic beauty, and he found a brilliant, witty, and cultured conversationalist. She spoke to him in his native Latin, though she was Greek. She maintained the conversation on politics, philosophy, strategy. She could be serious, and a minute later coquettish and playful. She captivated him not so much with mythical beauty as with her intellect, her charm, and her vitality. Antony was conquered. The accusations were forgotten. He became her guest, and then her ally. Their alliance, forged in Tarsus, was a complex amalgam of sincere passion, friendship, and cold political calculation. For Antony, Cleopatra was not a simple lover. She was the key to the East. She provided the money, the resources, and the fleet necessary for his great dream, a campaign against Parthia that would surpass the glory of Caesar. In her, he found not only a woman, but a partner of equal intellect with whom he could discuss plans to create a new empire. For Cleopatra, Antony was her new shield. He was the most powerful man in the East, the only one who could protect her throne from Rome's ambitions and guarantee the future of her son, Caesarion. She saw in him the strength and ambition she could direct where she wished. She dreamed of reviving Alexander's empire, and Antony, the new Dionysus, seemed the ideal partner for this purpose. She immediately began to use her influence. The first thing she did was convince Antony to eliminate her last rival, her younger sister, Arsinoe, who lived in exile in the temple of Artemis at Ephesus. Antony, violating the sacred right of asylum, ordered her assassinated on the very steps of the temple. It was a ruthless and cold move that proved Cleopatra would stop at nothing to protect her power. That same winter, Antony followed her to Alexandria. It was a period of banquets, festivities, and intellectual conversations. They founded a society called the Inimitable Livers, whose members competed in organizing the most luxurious and ingenious entertainments. They wandered the city at night, disguised as slaves, joking with the citizens. But behind all this paraphernalia lay a serious political alliance. Antony became increasingly imbued with the idea of a Hellenistic monarchy, and Cleopatra consolidated her power. But the idyll did not last long. Alarming news arrived from Rome. Antony's wife, Fulvia, and his brother Lucius had started a war against Octavian. They had been defeated, and Fulvia died shortly after. At the same time, the Parthians invaded the Roman provinces. Antony was forced to return to the west to resolve his affairs. He left a pregnant Cleopatra in Egypt, who would give birth to twins, Alexander Helios, the sun, and Cleopatra Selene, the moon. Their alliance was put on pause, but the foundations for the greatest drama of the final years of the Republic had already been laid. Upon returning to the West, Mark Antony was forced to immerse himself again in the complex world of Roman politics. To consolidate the fragile peace with his main rival, Octavian, he contracted a dynastic marriage.
He married Octavian's sister, Octavia the Younger, a noble and virtuous Roman matron respected by all. For 3 years, East and West signed a new truce. 3 years that Cleopatra waited in Alexandria, raising her twin children and governing her kingdom. For her, it was a time of humiliating uncertainty. She, a queen and goddess, had been abandoned for a political alliance with another woman. But Antony could not forget her, nor the riches of the East necessary for his great dream, the campaign against Parthia. In 37 BC, preparing for war, he summoned Cleopatra once again to Antioch. Their reunion marked a point of no return. Antony had definitively made his choice between Rome and the East, between Octavia and Cleopatra. He acknowledged their shared children and passed the winter with the Egyptian queen, planning the future campaign. Cleopatra, in turn, provided him with enormous financial resources and supplies for his army. Their union went from being romantic to becoming a solid political-military alliance. However, Antony's campaign against Parthia in 36 BC, which was supposed to be his greatest triumph, turned into a humiliating catastrophe. He lost nearly a third of his army, not so much in combat as from hunger and cold during the retreat. He returned defeated, but not broken. And it was Cleopatra who saved the remnants of his army, meeting him with provisions and money. This strengthened their bond, and his dependence on her even further. Having no real victory to celebrate, Antony decided to stage one. In 34 BC, in Alexandria, he organized a grandiose spectacle that passed into history as the Donations of Alexandria. It was an open and bold challenge to Rome and Octavian. In the city square, on golden thrones, sat Antony and Cleopatra, dressed as the goddess Isis. Beside them, on lower thrones, sat their children and Caesarion. Antony solemnly proclaimed Cleopatra Queen of Kings, and her son Caesarion King of Kings, and the legitimate son and heir of Julius Caesar. To his own children with Cleopatra, he distributed the titles of rulers of Armenia, Syria, and other eastern lands, many of which had not even been conquered yet. It was the declaration of the creation of a new and great Hellenistic empire independent of Rome, with its capital in Alexandria. For Cleopatra, it was the moment of her greatest triumph. Her dream of a great dynasty seemed to be coming true. But in Rome, this news had the effect of a bomb. For Octavian, it was a priceless gift. He held in his hands the most powerful weapon against his rival: propaganda. For several years, he conducted a methodical campaign in the Senate and on the streets of Rome to denigrate Antony. He did not present him as a Roman general, but as a will-less slave fallen under the spells of the licentious Egyptian queen. Octavian's propaganda was brilliant. He did not attack Antony himself, the idol of the legions. He attacked Cleopatra. They presented her as a monster, a drunkard, a witch who dreamed of destroying Rome and moving the capital of the world to Alexandria. The wildest rumors were spread. It was said she planned to storm the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill with her army of eunuchs. This campaign stoked xenophobia in the Romans, hatred for the barbaric and effeminate East, and fear of a strong woman in power. Antony went from being a hero to a traitor who had sold Rome to the Egyptian whore. The straw that broke the camel's back was when Octavian committed a sacrilege. He illegally opened and read in the Senate Mark Antony's will, which Antony had entrusted to the Vestal Virgins in Rome. In this will, Antony not only confirmed all the donations of Alexandria, but asked that his body, wherever he died, be sent to be buried in Alexandria beside Cleopatra. For the Romans, this was the definitive proof of his treason. Not even in death did he wish to remain in Rome. The Senate was enraged. Octavian had achieved his goal. He had the Senate strip Antony of all his powers and, most importantly, declare war. But formally, war was not declared on Antony. That would have unleashed another civil war. War was declared personally on Cleopatra. It was a stroke of genius. Octavian transformed a dirty struggle for power between two Romans into a sacred war of Rome against a foreign usurper queen. The confrontation became inevitable. In the summer of 31 BC, off the western coast of Greece, near the promontory of Actium, two gigantic armadas met. On the side of Antony and Cleopatra were some 500 ships, many of which were enormous but clumsy floating fortresses. In their fleet was also the Egyptian squadron of 60 ships, possibly commanded by Cleopatra herself. On Octavian's side, under the command of his brilliant admiral, Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, were some 400 ships, but they were lighter, faster, and more maneuverable Liburnians. On September 2nd, 31 BC, the Battle of Actium began, one of the most decisive and enigmatic naval battles in history. The course of the battle remains a subject of debate. Antony's fleet, trapped in the Gulf, tried to break Agrippa's blockade. In the heat of the battle, when the outcome was still uncertain, something strange occurred. Cleopatra, who was on her flagship, the Antoniadi, in the rear guard, ordered her squadron to hoist sails and abandon the fight, heading south toward Egypt. Seeing this, Mark Antony committed an act unthinkable for a general. He abandoned his army, his fleet, everything.
He transferred from his gigantic flagship to a fast quinquereme and launched himself in pursuit of Cleopatra's ship, leaving his men fighting and dying for him. What was that? A breakthrough planned in advance? Or a sudden flight and betrayal? Roman propaganda, of course, presented it as the cowardice of Antony, who, like a slave, followed his mistress. Perhaps the original plan was to break the encirclement with only part of the fleet and save the royal treasury to continue the war. But to the abandoned fleet and land army, it looked like betrayal. Deprived of their command, Antony's fleet fought for a few more hours and then surrendered. His land army, which had watched the catastrophe from the shore, defected to Octavian's side a week later. The defeat was total and crushing. The Battle of Actium was lost not so much by the force of arms as by the strange and fatal decision of two lovers. Their dream of an Oriental empire had collapsed. Now they could only wait for the victor, the cold and implacable Octavian, to come for them in Egypt. The escape from Actium marked the beginning of the end. Upon boarding Cleopatra's ship, Antony refused to speak to her. He marched straight to the prow and sat down alone. For 3 days, he remained there in silence, his head buried in his hands. He was the greatest general of his age after Caesar, the hero of the legions. Yet he had done the unimaginable. He had deserted his army in the heat of battle. The weight of this dishonor and the sheer scale of the disaster broke him completely. Cleopatra, however, did not collapse. The moment they reached Egypt, she sprang into action with a cold, almost superhuman resolve. She knew that news of the defeat could spark a rebellion in Alexandria, so she ordered her ships to be adorned with laurel wreaths, creating the illusion of a victorious return. Sailing into the harbor to festive music, she immediately launched a brutal purge of the city. Every wealthy or influential Alexandrian suspected of disloyalty was executed, their fortunes seized for the royal treasury. She was gathering funds to fight on. But the war was already lost. Reports of the total collapse at Actium and the defection of his land forces to Octavian spread rapidly across the east. One by one, the vassal kings abandoned him for the victor. The empire he had built through the donations of Alexandria crumbled like dust. When Antony arrived in Alexandria, he sank into a profound depression. He constructed a solitary retreat by the sea, naming it the Timonium, after Timon, the legendary misanthrope of Athens.
He shut himself away, proclaiming his hatred for a human race that had betrayed him. It took Cleopatra immense effort to draw him out of this darkness. She persuaded him to return to the palace, where they spent their final winter in a feverish, almost manic celebration. They disbanded their inimitable Livers Club and formed a new one, the Society of Those Who Die Together, pledging to face death united.
Months of feasting and drinking followed, a desperate attempt to drown out the approaching doom. Meanwhile, Octavian moved slowly but relentlessly. He was in no rush. He spent the winter securing his grip on Greece and Asia Minor, and in the spring of 30 BC, he launched his invasion of Egypt. Two armies advanced, one from Syria in the east, the other from Cyrenaica in the west. The last Hellenistic kingdom was trapped. Cleopatra attempted to negotiate until the very end. She sent envoys to Octavian, offering to abdicate if her children could inherit the throne. She even sent him her golden scepter and crown as a token of submission. But Octavian gave no clear answer. His goal was not just Egypt. His prize was Cleopatra herself. He intended to capture her alive and parade her in golden chains through Rome. It would be her ultimate humiliation and his greatest triumph, the final symbol of Rome's victory over the decadent East. He sent a secret message. If she killed Antony, he might show mercy. But even in despair, Cleopatra refused to betray her lover. By the summer of 30 BC, Octavian's legions stood at the gates of Alexandria. Antony, rousing himself from his stupor, decided to fight one last time. Leading his cavalry in a furious charge, he drove back Octavian's vanguard and returned to the palace with a final, fleeting victory. But it was the end. The next day, August 1st, the final battle was set. Antony deployed his remaining infantry, and his fleet sailed out to meet the enemy. And then came the ultimate betrayal. As the Egyptian fleet neared Octavian's ships, they did not attack. Instead, they raised their oars in surrender and joined the enemy. Seeing this, Antony's cavalry also defected. His army simply evaporated. Crushed, Antony returned to the palace, screaming that Cleopatra had betrayed him. But the queen was gone. Upon hearing of the defeat, she had locked herself in her unfinished mausoleum with two loyal handmaidens, Heiress and Charmian. From there, she sent a messenger to Antony with false news. She had taken her own life. Why? Perhaps she feared his rage, or perhaps it was a final act of tragic love. She wanted him to die believing she was gone, so he wouldn't suffer the pain of leaving her behind. When Antony heard the news, he did not hesitate. "Cleopatra," he whispered, "I am not sad to lose you, for I will join you soon. But I am ashamed that I, a great general, have been proven inferior in courage to a woman." He ordered his servant Heiress to kill him, but Heiress turned the sword on himself instead. Antony then fell upon his own sword, but the wound was not immediately fatal. He lay bleeding, begging those around him to end his life. At that moment, a second messenger arrived from the mausoleum. Cleopatra was alive. Hearing this, the dying Antony demanded to be taken to her. Soldiers carried him to the tomb. The doors were sealed, and Cleopatra dared not open them. Instead, she and her maids threw ropes from an upper window, tied them to Antony's stretcher, and with desperate strength hauled the dying man up. It was a scene of pure tragedy. She laid him on her bed, tearing her clothes and beating her chest, wiping his blood with her hair, calling him her husband and emperor. Antony asked for wine. He tried to comfort her, saying he died honorably, a Roman conquered by a Roman. And then he died in her arms. In that moment, the Ptolemaic kingdom fell. Its last defender was dead, and its queen, sealed in her tomb,
was left alone to face the victor, the cold, calculating Octavian, who had his own dark plans for her. The death of Antony left Cleopatra alone, facing the victor. Octavian, upon entering Alexandria, first ordered the queen's capture. He feared two things: that she would commit suicide, depriving him of his main trophy, or that she would burn the incalculable treasures of the Ptolemies, locked with her in the mausoleum. Treasures Octavian desperately needed to pay his legions. One of Octavian's officers, Gaius Proculeius, approached the locked doors of the mausoleum and began to negotiate. While he distracted Cleopatra by talking through the door, two other soldiers, placing a ladder, climbed through the upper window, the same one through which the queen had previously hoisted the dying Antony. Cleopatra, seeing them, immediately drew a dagger she carried to stab herself, but one of the soldiers managed to seize her hands. "It is unjust, Queen," he said, "to deprive yourself and Caesar, Octavian, of the opportunity to show magnanimity." She was captured in her own tomb. She was transferred under guard to the royal palace. Octavian assigned her a personal guard, the freedman Epaphroditus, with orders not to let her out of his sight for a second and to prevent any suicide attempt. She was the most important prisoner in the world. A few days later, Octavian agreed to meet with her. It was Cleopatra's last great battle, a battle she fought not with a fleet, but with her wit, her charm, and her diplomacy. Roman historians, writing at the dictation of Octavian's propaganda, would later describe her in this scene as a broken, sobbing woman trying to seduce the new master of the world. But that was far from the truth. Octavian entered her chambers. Cleopatra, according to Plutarch's testimony, received him reclining on a simple bed in a modest mourning dress. Her hair was disheveled, her face swollen from tears, and on her chest were bruises and scratches she had inflicted upon herself in her grief. She looked wretched. But as soon as she began to speak, her voice was full of dignity, and her mind retained its habitual sharpness. It was a duel between the two greatest politicians of their era. Cleopatra deployed all her art. She wept, remembering Caesar, trying to play on his adopted son's feelings. She flattered Octavian, calling him the master of the world. She tried to justify her actions, claiming she had fought against Rome not of her own will, but out of fear and love for Antony. She handed him a list of all her treasures, trying to show she was willing to cooperate. Octavian, cold and impenetrable, listened without showing any emotion. He was not Antony, nor Caesar. He was interested neither in her charms nor her riches. He already owned both. He methodically refuted each of her arguments, making her understand, politely but firmly, that her fate was decided. The only thing he promised her was merciful treatment. But Cleopatra was too perceptive. During the conversation, she understood what she feared most. She read it in his cold eyes, in his evasive answers. She understood that her ultimate fate was to be the centerpiece of his triumphal parade in Rome. A humiliation that she, descendant of Alexander, queen and goddess, could not endure. After Octavian's departure, she made her final decision. She obtained Octavian's permission to perform funeral rites for Antony's body and to prepare everything for her journey to Rome. It was a ruse. She wrote a farewell letter to Octavian in which she asked only one thing: to be buried beside Antony. She handed it to her guard Epaphroditus, with orders to take it immediately to Octavian. While he was gone, she gained a few precious minutes. She ordered her handmaidens, Heiress and Charmian, to prepare her finest royal robes. She took a bath, dressed, and organized a farewell banquet. And here the legend begins. According to the most widespread myth, at that moment a peasant entered the palace with a basket full of ripe figs. He told the guard it was a gift for the queen. The guards admired the large fruits and let him pass. In that basket, under the leaves, hid an asp, a small but deadly poisonous Egyptian cobra, the symbol of the divine power of the pharaohs. Octavian, upon receiving and reading her letter, instantly understood what had happened. He sent his men to the palace, but it was already too late. When they burst into her chambers, they saw a majestic and terrible scene. Cleopatra, in full royal regalia, with the diadem on her head, lay dead on her golden bed. At her feet lay one of her handmaidens, Charmian, dying, while the other, Heiress, staggering, adjusted the diadem on her mistress's head. "Is this well done, Charmian?" one of the soldiers managed to ask. "It is extremely well done," she replied, "and befitting the descendant of so many kings." And she fell dead. How exactly she died remains a mystery. On her arm, according to legend, 2 slight puncture marks were found. The legend of the snake was the most popular, the most dramatic, and the most symbolic. The bite of the sacred cobra did not disfigure the body, and was considered by Egyptians a way to achieve immortality, to join the gods. But there were other theories, that she pricked herself with a hairpin dipped in poison, or drank a poison she always carried in a ring. Octavian was furious. She had defeated him. She had deprived him of his main triumph. He could not parade her in chains through Rome. But he organized a grandiose funeral for her. As she had asked, she was buried with full royal honors in the same mausoleum as Mark Antony. He spared the lives of her children with Antony. But her eldest son, Caesarion, the son of Caesar, who for Octavian was a direct political competitor, he ordered murdered in cold blood, pronouncing the famous phrase, "Too many Caesars is not good." Thus, on August 12th, 30 BC, ended not only the story of Cleopatra, but that of the entire Hellenistic world that had begun with the conquests of Alexander the Great. Egypt became a Roman province. Cleopatra's suicide was not an act of despair. It was her final act of will, her last political statement. She chose the death of a queen, not the life of a prisoner. And in that death, she found immortality. Roman propaganda, which tried to turn her into a caricature seductress, in the end only created one of the most attractive and enduring myths in history. But behind that myth hid a real woman, a brilliant politician, a wise ruler, and the last great queen who dared to challenge destiny and lost, but did so on her own terms.